At the Trauma and Community Resilience Center, I identified as a Hispanic female. I was born and raised in El Salvador. I migrated to the US in 2013, not so long ago. Of course, my first language is Spanish, and I am continuously an English learner. Yeah, and my hope is to continue my education in psychology and be able to help and support youth and families. And now we'll pass it to my colleague, Kayla.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kayla Majabin-Parr, and I'm really excited to share space with you all today. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a postdoctoral psychology fellow here at the center. I'm also a trained school psychologist and was previously an educator in Boston and New York City. And a lot of my approaches to the work are informed by a multicultural upbringing and growing up in a community where there was a lot of stigma related to mental health. Given each of our positionalities and experiences, we are entering today's training each from a different lens. You may be entering this space as someone with minimal connection to or understanding of experiences of forced migration and displacement. You may be entering as someone who has experienced forced migration and displacement yourself, and you may be entering as someone who is concerned for family, friends, or community members who are currently experiencing forced migration and displacement. We will each be differentially impacted by today's conversation, and we invite you to take care of yourselves throughout our time together. We'd like to start off by taking a moment to ground together in this virtual shared space, and to do so, I'll be guiding us through a grounding exercise. If it is within your practice, I'll invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze. Begin to notice your breathing. There's no need to control or change it. Simply notice its natural rhythm. As you breathe, imagine a strong, steady tree. Imagine stepping into this tree where your arms become the branches, your body and legs become the trunk, and your feet become the start of the root system. Visualize roots extending from your feet. Feel these roots growing more extensive with each breath you take, reaching out in all directions, spreading in partnership with the land. Come back again to your breath. As you breathe in, the body expands until you reach a pause. As you breathe out, the body relaxes until again it reaches a pause. Notice that pause, that bridge that connects the constant cycle, that constant flow between expanding and returning. In that pause, we bring awareness to our lineage, our elders, past, present, and emerging. Visualize all the people that came before you. People who made it possible for you to be who you are today. Think of the ancestors and elders that have been core to you. Think about the origin stories of your elders, their own elders, and their own back in time, to their respective places all around the world, wherever it may be. Recognize the complexity of lineage and hold that complexity in your heart. Now imagine roots extending out from your feet and connecting to those elders and to their lands. The different lands that touch their feet, the different elders whose feet touch different lands, until your lineage came here, to this place, to the ground under your feet. Feel the deep connection of your roots beneath you, creating a vast support system of community. I'll invite you now to take one more breath, expanding, pausing, returning, pausing. Take a moment now to arrive here, back in our shared space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. All right, so we'll transition now to talking about what are we doing here today. So as all of you are on the call today, we have been fortunate enough to receive, as I said, funding from SAMHSA to support this best practice series. And some of you may have joined us 2 years ago when we did our first series, which was really for clinicians on supporting immigrant refugee youth. Last year, we did some work with police force across the US. And then this year, the series really focuses on school professionals and school systems. So as you'll see here, these are the 5 trainings that we'll be offering. Caroline will be posting in the chat if you're interested in watching the recordings from some of the other webinars we've done. Feel free to watch those. But today, really, the hope is to begin this conversation about the newcomer experience and journey coming into the US or other resettlement places. And as you see, as we continue then throughout the sessions will be offered in March and April and May, we will get more specific in thinking about school-wide supports, classroom support, supporting kids with educational gaps. And then the last session will focus on really thinking about behavioral health interventions and supports. The goal for today is that we have 3 questions to hopefully answer together. One is that we'll spend some time really thinking about what are the different migration journeys of forcibly displaced families. We know that there are some commonalities, but we also know there are differences. Then from there, we'll move into really talking about the cultural and contextual factors that shape the resettlement experiences of student families that you may be working with. And then we'll close out by beginning to have a conversation about what is the role of school and why do schools matter when we think about resettlement. And throughout this, you will hear pieces of Doris's story of her own migration journey to really bring light to both, again, commonalities and differences across stories. So to get us started today, I imagine that many of you are here because you yourself, as Kayla said, come from an immigrant refugee background, or your family, or you work with students who've been impacted. And we know, I mean, all we have to do is turn on the news or even walk into our school systems to know that current numbers of communities that are forcibly displaced are ever growing. And we know that every minute, 20 people are forced to flee their home to escape conflict, persecution, and natural disasters. And 20 people, for those of us that work in schools, is the size of a classroom. So it's hard to kind of wrap your brain around, right, how many communities are impacted. Currently, we know as of 2023, there are 110 million people displaced worldwide. We know out of those 110 million, 42% are children and adolescents. Within that, we know that most individuals and communities that are forcibly displaced will actually remain often in low to middle income countries neighboring their own. And we know that only 1% of those that are displaced will receive a refugee status. And by that meaning, they'll be able to resettle to a country like United States. And finally, we know that we as a country are seeing unprecedented numbers of forcibly displaced communities. Currently, as of 2023, there are 49.5 million, or 15% of the US population are immigrants. And we know that there are many terms that are used to describe this community, and that we have heard in the news, or even that we use interchangeably as we work with students in our schools. However, we also know that these terms, matter, and these terms are powerful and have evolved with time. And we know that the US, our own history in the US has a really long history of laws and attitudes toward new arrivals. And our laws and attitudes are really vacillated between welcoming and exclusionary, that are often based on one's race, ethnicity, and class. We also know that public narratives and legal texts are filled with kind of binaries of how we describe these communities as citizen or non-citizen, legal or illegal. And the reason this matters is that we know that labels, how we label people, has significant legal, political, and social meaning. For example, immigration status has direct implications in regards to rights, in regards to access to healthcare benefits, educational benefits, work benefits, and resources that are afforded and available to different communities. And we also know that terms also have the power to influence public perception response. So for example, there was a survey done in US a year or two ago to look at how we understand refugee versus migrant term, and found that we tend to be more sympathetic and understanding and welcoming, and feel like refugees need refuge compared to when we use words like migrant. So for our time today, and really future sessions, we'd like to use language to forced migration displacement. And we feel like this term really encompasses all of the language that we've been talking about. And when we think about forced migration displacement, we're really talking about involuntary coerced movement of person or people away from their home or home region in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situation of generalized violence they may be experiencing, violations of human rights, and or natural or human-made disasters. I'll pass it back to Kayla.
As Vanya just discussed, the socio-political narratives about people and communities create stories, and how we perceive these stories is incredibly powerful. We will illustrate this through a clip from Chimamanda Adichie's talk entitled "The Power of a Single Story," or "The Danger of a Single Story."
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well, and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is Nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of Nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African states and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
To understand other people's stories beyond the lens of a single story, we have to start by understanding our own story. In order to do that, we must recognize that each of us has unique intersectional identities, experiences, and histories that inform our worldview and way of relating to others. Regardless of our identities, we all have biases. And when bias is reinforced by powerful groups and social structures, the results are systems that perpetuate oppression. The systems, policies, and practices in the US have been designed to privilege access to resources and power to certain individuals and communities and prohibit access to others. The graphic on the right of the slide illustrates identities at the center, those with greater access to money, resources, and privilege, and identities on the borderlands, those whose access to power and resources has been prohibited within our political and sociocultural systems. We all have the opportunity and ethical responsibility to choose to work towards dismantling these inequities. We have the power to give more access to people and communities that have been historically and are presently prohibited from having access. And we can do this in our interpersonal relationships, such as with students, and in our systems. And the systems we're here talking about, the system we're here talking about today is schools. And we can do this by engaging in self-evaluation and self-critique. So what is my own relationship to power and privilege? How am I unintentionally perpetuating exclusionary practices? Where do I have limiting stories? We can do it through self-learning. What do I need to learn, unlearn, and learn more about? And we can do that through self-accountability. How can I make changes? We can recognize, acknowledge, and change power dynamics in relationships with students and families. And we can do this by implementing systems-level policy and practice changes in schools that promote equity. When we're thinking about communities impacted by forced migration and displacement, it's essential for us to hold multiple stories. The designation of people and communities as refugee or immigrant is a socio-political construction designed by political and socio-cultural systems that decide at a given point in time how to label and define a person's experience. Those labels and definitions today are different than they were 10 years ago and different than they will be 10 years from now. And they are a single story. So in order to hold multiple stories, we need to recognize that forcibly displaced youth and families have incredible resilience, and many understandably suffer the downstream effects of systematic trauma and oppression. This means that political systems have deep personal implications for people and communities. And I'll now turn it back to my colleague, Vanya.
Thank you, Kayla. So we enter now by thinking about this first question. We started by defining context and the importance of thinking about stories. And now we enter to think about what are the different migration journeys that forcibly displaced families take. To begin, it's important that we ground this in, what we call the social ecological model. And really, often when we think about the student that ends up in our classroom, we focus on the individual here that's in the middle. But to understand that individual, to understand that student that, was dropped off in your classroom or in your school system, we have to understand the ecologies that impact that student, their family system, the community they're in, the neighborhood, their social supports and networks, the culture that they're coming from, the countries, the systems. So all of these ecologies have a profound effect on that individual. And all of these ecologies impact one another. So as we think about the migration journey, sometimes you might have heard it called as the trauma triple paradigm, to understand the student that walked into our classroom, we really have to begin, by understanding their pre-migration. Where are they from? Where were they born? What was that country like? And think about ecology, all of these different ecologies, which we'll talk about in a second. We also have to understand the migration journey itself for them. So what was that journey like? Who did they go with? How long was that journey? All impacts who arrives again in your classroom. And then lastly, we have to understand, their post-migration life. And what I mean by post-migration is really once they have resettled, once they have walked into your classroom, what are the experiences of that child, that family system that impact how they show up. But all three of these, and these look many different ways, have implications for who they are today, but also who they're going to be in the future. So first, let's start by thinking about the pre-migration experience. Pre-migration really simply means the period of time prior to leaving one's home country. And home, and we can have a whole training on defining home and concept of home, but here we're really thinking about places, spaces, feelings associated, practices, cultural practices, values, political systems that one was part of, and when they think about home life. And we also know that home is an active state of being in the world, right? How we define home today may be different than how we define it tomorrow for ourselves. We also know for this community, there's a wide range of experiences, contexts, and stressors in which how they define home and their experiences of home. So when we think about pre-migration, there are several key questions that my colleagues Heidi and Saida and Jeff had really developed to think about what are some things that I may be thinking of for that child that's entering my classroom. And this doesn't mean you're going to be asking all of these questions of your students, but they're just considerations for you to keep in mind as you're thinking about interventions and supports. First, we're thinking about to what degree did the child experience in that family stability and normalcy before migration? Did violence or need to migrate happen overnight? If we think about context of, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, or has violence and disruption and instability been something that the families experienced for a long time? If we think about some of our families that are coming from Central America, where there's been ongoing violence, if we think about refugees from Somalia, where there's been a 30-year war, right? So really thinking about to what extent there has been stability and instability. We're also, as part of that, thinking about to what extent has the child had access to education and what kind of education? Were they in a classroom with 40 students or 15? Healthcare, sanitation, security, and nutrition as part of their development. To what extent have they been exposed to adversity, instability prior to migration? So really thinking about what is the type of stressor or stressors that the system has experienced. We're also thinking about how does the family view their resettlement need for resettlement? Is it something that everybody agrees on? Is there a difference of opinion? Was it a sudden decision, a prolonged decision, and so forth? And we're thinking about what has been the caregiver's experience of loss of professional status opportunity due to, right, stressors they may be experiencing within their pre-migration journey. I'm going to turn it now to my colleague Doris to give her own story of pre-migration.
Hi everyone. So I would like to start saying that these two pictures means a lot to me because they were part of my life for many years. So the first picture that you see, that's just a tiny little house that you can probably call it storage. That's where I lived. That's where I grew up with my family. All you see is all it was. So we only had 2 mattresses down in the floor at nighttime and against the wall and during the day for us to be able to walk around. We did not have a living room or a kitchen or own bedroom. We barely had enough to eat, so that's all we had. And on the second picture, that's the school that I went to, and at the same as the house where I lived in, all you see is all it was. So we only had 2 classrooms. And as you can see from the colors, blue and white, that is in representation of our flag. So all schools in El Salvador have these 2 colors. So the school was basically only 2 classrooms. The first classroom was for first, second, third, and fourth grade, and in the other classroom was 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And I do have to highlight that we had the same teacher for one classroom. That was the same teacher for the other classroom as well. So she had to divide herself to not only teach 2 classrooms at the same time, but also to teach different education levels because we were all in different levels. So we were like probably around between 30 and 50 students per classroom. So we were many students. But I always dreamed to be in the other classroom because, you know, that's where the cool kids were. They were like older than me, and I was in the 4th grade already, so I was very close to move to the other classroom. But due to you know, economic situation and gang related, I couldn't go to the other classroom. I had to drop off school. So unfortunately, the school was located on the MS-13, and I lived in the 18th Street area. For those who don't know, for many years, El Salvador was divided by 2 gang members, MS-13 and 18th Street. So just by crossing that invisible border between the school and my house was very dangerous, not only for me, but for my siblings as well, and for many other kids that had to drop off school because of the same situation. Back to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Doris. Okay. So we opened up by talking about the pre-migration, so life at home, as Doris has shared her own story. We're moving into now thinking about the migration journey itself. And really what we mean here is the period in which one or family system makes a decision to flee one's home country. This decision to migrate can be sudden, literally hours, or overnight decision that you have to go, or it can be something that is more gradual, that families deciding, and then, but typically there is a certain window of time that the families leave. And similar to when we think about the pre-migration experience, we know there's a wide range of migration journeys and experiences that the students and families take. So when we think about this phase, there are a couple questions that oh no, sorry, my computer is having some issues. There are a couple questions that we're thinking about, key considerations here. First, we're thinking about how long was the journey. For some students, it may be an overnight trip on a plane. For others, it may be days or months that they are taking multiple modes of transportation, and stopping at different places and spaces along the way. And for others, it's years or generations. So if we think about some families that go into a refugee camp, and then a child may be born in a refugee camp before they ever arrive to a resettlement country. So these journeys take very different routes. I think about a lot of, I work a lot with the Brazilian youth right now, and many have stopped in different countries along the way before they arrived to the US and to Boston, where we are. Or even a lot of our kids that are coming from Central America have stopped at different routes before they arrived to your school and your community. We're also thinking as part of this that the family stay in a refugee camp in a neighboring country near them. And if so, what were the conditions? And as part of that, conditions like sanitation, access to healthcare, safety, but also that they have access to formal, informal education. If their journeys were months or years, this has implications on their education and what they're coming in with, especially if we think about families that are arriving post-pandemic on. There has been so many educational ruptures along the way as kids are arriving, both in their home countries, but also along the journey itself. We're also thinking about, as part of migration, what kind of trauma or loss occurred. It is not uncommon, and we'll talk about trauma a little bit later in the training, but it's not uncommon for families, unfortunately, to experience traumatic stressors along the way and violence as they're migrating. It's also not uncommon for family members to be separated from their loved ones on the journey, to be placed in detention centers separately, to lose family members along the way. So considering that as well. We're also thinking about families' financial obligations. Did they pay a coyote or somebody else to help them take the journey? And what are the risks and stressors associated with that, both as part of the migration journey, but also life once they resettle? And we're thinking about, is their resettlement to the country they're going to legal, or is the family at risk of deportation? Of course, this will have lots of implications then on the journey itself, but also supports once they arrive. I'm going to pass it back to Doris now to share a little bit about her migration journey.
So, as you saw in the pictures before, so the reason why I left my country is very obvious. I did not leave my country because I didn't love my family enough, or I didn't love my siblings enough to stay with them. I actually left my country because I loved them so deeply that I wanted for them to have a better future than the future that they were in already. So so my story is very particular because I did not tell anyone that I was coming to the US. I actually told, because of course I didn't have the money to afford that. So I told my mom that I was going to to be able to get into a school for an adult program, because I was already 17 years old by that time. And as you remember, I left school when, in 4th grade, so I already had a huge gap. So I had to go into an adult program. My mom believed in me, but in reality, I was coming to the US because prior days, I spoke with a coyote and I told him that I wanted to come to the US. And I told him that my dad was going to pay him when I arrived into Mexico. My dad, as a little background information, was already in the US. He came on early 2000s, but we didn't have a good communication, so I didn't know much about him. But I knew enough to lie to the coyote, and he believed in my story, and he told me that he was going to bring me to the US. So I couldn't hug my mom one last time because I didn't want her to suspect that I was, leaving the house for good. That's, something that I had in my chest for years. But today, I would like to share the first date of my journey. So I was left in a hotel room in Honduras. The coyote told me that he was going to pick me up the same date or night, and he didn't. So I waited all night for him. He did not show up. I still I was, waiting for him. And around noon the next day, someone knocked my door, and that was the housekeeper. She told me that I didn't have another night paid, so either I had to pay for another night or leave the hotel. and I only had 25 cents on my pocket, so that was not enough to cover for another night. So I had to, leave the room, and I was waiting outside in the hotel just to wait for the coyote to arrive and pick me up again. And a few hours passed by, and this guy went to me, and he was like, "Are you with this coyote?" And I said, "Yes." And he was like, "Follow me." And I followed him. Now that I think about it, like, how dangerous that situation was. But in that, when you are coming to the US by foot, you literally have no choice, because you will not meet all of the coyotes on FaceTime just to be like, "Hey, so this is the team, this is my team, this is the people that you are going to meet on each country." No, like, you literally meet them on day by day. And I'm talking about 3 to 7 to 10 people per country. So I'm not talking about just one single coyote. I'm talking about a whole organization that you meet on a daily basis. So when I arrived into Mexico, of course, my dad didn't know that I was coming to the US. So he was very upset for many different reasons. And the first reason, number one, is that we didn't have a good communication. And he already had another family. So he left me in Mexico for around 50 days. And the day number 50, I will never forget the date, because the coyote called my dad and told my dad that he was not going to see me ever in his life again if he didn't pay the money. So my dad ended up paying the money, and that's how I ended up being detained by Border Patrol and later transferred to an OR facility that I will be talking more about it later during the day. And back to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Doris, and thank you for sharing your story today. As we transition, we think now about life once the student or family arrives. So here we're really talking about a child has now been through the pre-migration, migration, and now they're entering our communities and our schools. So when we're thinking about post-migration, we're really thinking about a period that is a combination of both new challenges and opportunities for families. We know that post-migration is deeply influenced by social determinants of health. And this includes, broader social and policy forces, things like, safe environments, adequate food and housing for newly arrived families, access to healthcare, and access to stable and appropriate employment. However, we know that social determinants of health impact all communities and all people. When we think about this specific community, the nature of migration experiences itself, as well as different policies, both national, state, and regional, and as we talked in the beginning, public attitudes around forcibly displaced communities can really result in a greater likelihood of negative social conditions post-migration, which we'll talk about. And we also know that how individuals experience this post-migration journey themselves is really a combination of both their internal strengths and stressors, but also external strengths and stressors. So our team here at the TCRC several years ago developed a framework to really think about what are the kind of core experiences or core stressors that individuals who've been forcibly displaced, and I know it says here refugee and immigrant, but we're thinking about all communities that have been forcibly displaced. What are the core experiences for children and youth upon arrival? And the four that we'll be really talking about for the remainder of our time is experience of resettlement, experience of acculturation, experiences of isolation, and experiences of trauma. And our center, if you're interested, has actually developed a toolkit that Caroline will be putting in a chat in a second, and we have a whole training that discusses this toolkit. But really, the toolkit is designed for providers, for nurses, to use as a way to assess these different core stressors. And then you can see that based on then the questions that are asked and where the child falls, you can then think about different interventions. So if you're interested in learning more about the toolkit, it's free. It's been used both nationally and internationally now by many communities. Feel free to check it out after the training. But for the purposes of our time today, we're going to really just describe each of these resettlement stressors and think about some supports. So when we think about resettlement, we're really thinking about those initial experiences that families take upon arrival to the host country. And as you can imagine, the process of resettlement brings on lots of challenges. There can often be financial stress of both potentially needing to pay back, as Doris was talking about, but also stress of coming into a new community, especially given, standard of living in communities that they're coming into and how expensive life can be. Stressors related to attending to basic needs, such as access to food, access to healthcare, access to transportation. And this will be so dependent on the size and the resources of the city or a community that they're coming into. If a family is coming into an urban setting, right, the level of resources may look very different than in a remote small community. They may not have public transportation. They may not have some of these systems in place. We also know that we as a country are experiencing a housing crisis. And we know that this housing crisis has deeply impacted our immigrant refugee communities from pandemic on, but even if we think about current numbers of migrants that are coming in. We know that it's not uncommon for parents or caregivers to experience stressors related to unemployment or underemployment. So difficulty finding jobs due to lack of language. It's not uncommon for the degrees that adults have do not qualify or count here. So they're really trying to figure out this new way of being and being employed. We know that legal status can be a huge stressor, as we said before, about not only the resources you can access in communities and supports, but also just navigating new systems. Experience of educational history, right? Thinking about kids who've experienced, have there been gaps in education, and how that will have implications for once they arrive. And then stressors just related to navigating new community. How do I get around? Where do I go for help? And supports related to that. I'm going to turn it back to Doris again to talk a little bit about her resettlement experience.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I was considered a minor when I crossed the U.S. border. So OR facilities released me with my dad, but of course, like things did not work out as I thought. For many different reasons. So my mom had a second cousin that I called uncle for years. So living in Boston, so I decided to move to Boston because I really wanted to learn English and understand the language at least, and work at the same time. So I was able to do my placement test for Somerville High School. And I always like to tell the story that the only thing that I got right in that placement test was my name, because not even the date, because the date here it's written differently. It's month, date, and year, and in my country first is day, month, and year. So it was very different. As you all remember, I didn't had the best education growing up. And of course, I had a huge gap at the same time. So after I got into the school and I got to meet all the counselors and all the amazing people I met on Somerville High School, I trusted them enough to disclosure something concerning to one of the counselors, and she decided that that my uncle's house was not a safe place for me to be in. So the same night, the same date, I moved to a shelter that was on Davis Square. So I was the only 18 at that time, 18-year-old living in a shelter with a bunch of random people, going to school and also going to work at the same time, because I was already supporting my family back home with financial needs. So living in a shelter was very, very difficult for me because I did not speak the language. I didn't speak English, so I couldn't understand anybody in the shelter. And in a shelter, I mean, at least in the shelter I was in, I had to sign in to go to the restroom and sign out to, when I was leaving the restroom out. So like for me to understand all of the signing in part was very, very difficult, along that the shelter had some rules. I had to be in the shelter by, I believe, 8 p.m. if I'm not mistaken. And my work day ended at 11 p.m. So we had to come to an agreement that I was, they understood that I was working, so they allowed me to get into the shelter late during the night, which was wonderful. So I was dealing, of course, with acculturation stressors. I was dealing with trauma, even though I didn't know what trauma was. I had history of trauma in my little tiny brain. I was working 50 plus hours per week. I literally had time for nothing. And you can think that, okay, so working 50 plus hours a week, so you did not stress about money. And that's not true. I was like stressed about money all the time, because I became the mother of my mother. I became the mother of my siblings, and I had to support them financially, since a pair of shoes to healthcare. So I had to pay for everything, which I'm not complaining about. I'm just happy that I did that. So lack of resources. So I came to Boston in 2013, October 2013, starting fall. Fall was, good. It was actually really good weather. The problem was when the winter came. I did not had good clothing. I did not had good shoes. So winter on 2013 was really, really hard for me, because I did not had a single jacket. I remember that staff member from Sunrise High School gave me a jacket that I still have in my closet, because it's a good reminder of who I am and all the things that I went through to be here today. Transportation difficulties. I did not understand the map of the train, and I still cannot understand the map. So it was very difficult for me. I got lost thousands of times, and I think that if I take a train right now, I will get lost still. But it was very difficult for me to get that. And as you know, when I first came to the US, I did not speak English at all. So my future was not, I was not expecting to be here today. I was not expecting to be talking to all of you today, or presenting to you, or even working for Boston Children's Hospital. I was not expecting that in my future, but I'm very glad that I am here. Back to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Doris. And you'll hear for Doris one more time as we close out today again. So as thinking about then resettlement experience, we have put some questions together as just some considerations for you individually of how you're thinking about resettlement needs and experience of your students. And also as a school and a community, what are some considerations you should be thinking about? And again, these are designed as individual self-reflection. As we said, it starts with us, but also questions that you may then begin to ask your teams and systems of support when we consider resettlement experience. And we'll have a resource guide to kind of share with you that includes these questions as well, that you can use as part of conversations in the future. And I'm going to pass it now over to Kayla.
Thank you. And I think Caroline just shared a link in the chat if you want to kind of follow along with that resource guide to track any thoughts that might come up for you as we continue to move through the presentation. The next core stressor that I'll talk about is acculturation. Acculturation is a process of cultural and psychological change that happens when an individual from one culture is adapting to a new culture. And forcibly displaced youth and families are navigating how to balance maintaining aspects of their origin culture. And when I say origin culture, I'm referring to the cultural context prior to migration, and adapting to aspects of the new culture. And the process of acculturation is dynamic and lifelong, meaning that it looks different for someone that has just arrived for example, to the US than for someone that's been living in the US for 5 years or 10 years. There are many factors that impact an individual's acculturative process, and some of those are listed here on the slide. And so, for example, this process is going to look different for a 17-year-old who's being reunified with a parent in the US that they haven't seen in years and has no choice regarding migrating to the US, compared to a 17-year-old who made the decision themselves to come to the US. This process is going to look different for a 10-year-old Guatemalan youth that grew up in a rural village in Guatemala and is resettling to the Bronx in New York in a predominantly Latin, Hispanic, Spanish-speaking neighborhood, compared to a 10-year-old Guatemalan youth that grew up in Guatemala City and is resettling to Alexandria, Virginia, in a predominantly white and English-speaking neighborhood. This process is going to look different for a Somali student who is the only Muslim student at their new school and is discriminated against for wearing hijab than for a Somali student who, for example, attends a diverse school that's created a designated prayer space for Muslim identifying students during Ramadan. This process is going to look different across different ages and stages of life. For example, a 5-year-old versus 16-year-old versus 45-year-old is going to have a really different acculturative process. And so it's really important to understand the process of acculturation as dynamic and lifelong. And acculturative stress is stress that stems from the challenges of adapting to a new culture. People used to think that individuals who were able to completely adopt or assimilate to the new culture had the best outcomes overall, and we now recognize that this is not the case. It's the people that can live in both worlds, that of their origin culture and that of the new culture, and develop a bicultural identity that have less acculturative stress and greater overall well-being. It's really important to note that a bicultural identity is highly person and experience dependent. There's no recipe or ratio for what values, practices, languages, customs, beliefs people ought to maintain from their culture of origin or adopt from the new culture. And there may even be this integration of your origin culture and new culture and other cultural influences that create a distinct value, belief, way of being that forms a sort of third culture. Each person is going to navigate developing a bicultural identity differently, largely based on the factors that we just discussed: the context of migration and resettlement, the experience of being welcomed or discriminated against, the age and stage of life. And some common acculturative stressors include learning a new language, adopting customs, changing dress and appearance, adjusting to new food and cuisines, modifying behavior, making friends with people of a different culture, acquiring cultural knowledge, participating in new activities and hobbies, embracing new beliefs, adapting to a new climate, learning new sporting, political, and news culture. Much of this you heard Doris talk about previously, and we'll talk more about. The acculturative stressors that we just discussed can create internal, interpersonal, and systemic conflicts, and many acculturative conflicts cut across these different domains. Youth may struggle to form an integrated identity due to difficulty making sense of clashes between cultures at home and school, pressures from other students to fit in, pressures from caregivers to not be, quote, too American. And due to children often acculturating more quickly than their caregivers, there may be parent-child conflicts, miscommunications, and differences in expectations between youth and caregivers. For youth that migrate at a young age, for example, they may have more proficiency and comfort in English than in their native language, resulting in youth and caregivers feeling like they can't fully communicate and express themselves at a deeper level in a shared language. Youth may feel like parents don't understand them or have unreasonable expectations For example, teens may feel like their peers have more freedom and less responsibilities than they do. Youth may feel frustrated or privy to information beyond what's developmentally appropriate due to the necessity of acting as interpreters for family members that are not fluent in English. And youth may struggle not only with educational gaps within the school setting, but also with language and how that impacts their social development, balancing work responsibilities and school responsibilities, navigating transportation to school. And research highlights that perceived discrimination is the most significant factor underlying a culture of stress and has been associated with higher levels of mental health symptoms, low self-esteem, and isolation. Despite research indicating that a culture of stress has such a significant impact on youth overall functioning and well-being, it's underrepresented as a target for interventions. And students in your schools are going to be looking for trusted peers and adults for support. So here are some key questions to consider at an individual and school and systems level related to acculturation. And I will pass it back to Vanya.
Thank you, Kayla. The next stressor we'll talk about is isolation. And when we think about isolation, we know the newly arrived families are more often risk of greater exposure to social isolation than host populations. And often the biggest barrier to that is, they're looking for new networks and they're reestablishing themselves in a new community. And again, to Kayla's point, what this looks like when one enters a community, there's already an ethnic or cultural community that they belong to, versus if they're the first person in their region that are coming from that country, will look different when we think about social isolation. We also know, and we've experienced this, we've read a lot about this in terms of the pandemic. We know that social isolation and loneliness has really been associated with increased risk of developing mental health problems and can really exacerbate existing vulnerabilities to other health outcomes. When we think specifically about communities of enforced displaced, there are a couple kind of key isolation stressors that we are thinking about. First, we know that often forcibly displaced communities experience a low sense of social belonging, and which can be connected to what Kayla was talking about right now. It can be connected to acculturation stress. It can be connected to experience of discrimination, but feeling like you belong in the community is often a huge stressor as you're newly arrived. We also know that communities can lack informal and formal social supports and connections. So as if we think about a child who comes in a company by themselves in an entering community, will look very different than a family that comes together. Or if we think about a family that comes and has other family in a city that they're arriving to, or a local mosque or a church or a cultural center to go to, will look very different than a family that comes that doesn't have any other friends or family here, or other local communities or systems that they can join. We know there can also often be a loss of social status, especially if we think about adults and caregivers. You may go from working a job in an office to now people treating you like you don't understand and you're not educated just because you don't speak the language, or even the types of jobs you can have, or the access to things. And I work a lot with high schoolers, and high schoolers talk about social status as well from a different perspective of, like, in my school, I knew everybody, I knew the language, I knew the lingo, I knew everything. And now here I'm new and I'm the only one. So social status is not necessarily just about, career, but also thinking about other identities that we carry. And as Kayla was mentioning, we know that many newly arrived families experience discrimination and othering, both overt discrimination, right? Why do you wear a hijab? Why are you here? Go home. To covert, right? Thinking about opportunities that are afforded or not afforded. Thinking about who sits with the child at lunch and who doesn't. And we know that often discrimination and othering is deeply embedded in our structural kind of oppression and bias that we have in our systems, and what infrastructure we have in the first place to support communities. So one way that you can think about, isolation and ways to then promote belonging is this model that I think is helpful when you think about what infrastructure we have in our systems. And one aspect of belonging is really thinking about bonding. And bonding is this idea that connections with someone who's similar to you, and they may share same language or same country of origin and same ethnicity. So here I'm thinking about, as a new child arrives, right, in your school, are there opportunities for them to connect with other kids, to bond with other kids who may speak the same language, same country, same ethnicity, or even just to say, hey, we're both immigrants, right? What are the opportunities for bonding in your schools as you think about students you're working with? We're also thinking about bridging relationships, and bridging relationships are really connections with somebody who's different sociocultural background or experience identities. So maybe that, you know, they are from a different country, or they, but, you know, or maybe how do we create connections for students that were born in the US and then students who are arriving? So really thinking of what are opportunities in your school, in your classroom, that we're creating for bridging for students who are coming from different backgrounds and different experiences. And then the last one, and we think about, is we think about the concept of linking. And linking is really connection with somebody who's often outside your family, who's in a position of power. And all of us in this room, I'm imagining, are in some position of power when we think about working with kids and young people. So examples of linking is teachers, coaches, counselors, principals, whatever role you have in your school system. You know, here we're thinking about what opportunities are we taking to link ourselves with students in our newly arrived students in our school. So for example, you know, are there opportunities when a new student arrives that they have an adult that they can talk to, that they know that is the person that they can reach out if they have questions? Or do you have advisory in your school that there's a place for linking with students? So really thinking about what are those adult relationships that currently exist or need to be expanded on. And as part of that, we put some questions for, again, to think about isolation. So on the individual level, what are some ways that you are connecting with students and bonding? What are some ways that you are bridging? And what are some ways that you're linking? And then we're also thinking about that on a school system level. What are opportunities for bonding, bridging, and linking across your school? But also, we know that school policies and practices also deeply, you know, impact levels of isolation and connection in our schools. So for example, you know, thinking about, you know, what opportunities are there? How is our lunch structured? How are hallways structured? Who's in classes with who? And that all impacts then opportunities for connection and belonging. Give me a second, my computer sometimes takes its time. So the last stressor that we'll talk about is trauma. And full disclosure, that trauma, we know in traumatic stress can be all of these can be a training in itself. But when we think about trauma for this community, we're really thinking about trauma through the lens of power and oppression. And we know that trauma is deeply structural, meaning that, you know, we have the child in the middle that may be impacted by traumatic stress. But to understand how we define trauma, how we respond to trauma, is deeply rooted in oppression and our oppressive systems. So, of course, then that child is impacted by living conditions they're in, you know, the physical environment, the social environment, the economic environment. That child is impacted by social institutions such as schools, health centers, community centers, governments that either support repair or further perpetuate and re-traumatize and harm. And it's deeply connected to social inequities in our systems. So, as we said, bias and discrimination that one may experience, and whether it's class, sexual orientation, immigration status, all of these deeply impact one another and ultimately impact exposure to traumatic stress, but also then how it's understood, what resources afforded to those children, and so forth. So when we think about trauma, we're really thinking about experiences or situations that are emotionally or psychologically distressing and overwhelm one's ability to cope, right? That overwhelm is the key piece here. We know that trauma is a biochemical response or stressful situation that really leads to a fight, flight, or freeze response to survive. And that as part of that, you know, with time, these systems to survive or adaptive can become maladaptive ways of coping. We know that trauma is both discrete, meaning a one-time, as well as complex, multiple wounds. And when we think about immigrant refugee youth, we are focusing more on multiple wounds. We're thinking about pre-migration experience, migration, as well as traumatic stresses that occur once families resettle. We're also thinking about resources, both supports and protective factors that are overwhelmed for that individual in that time and context. We know that, like we just said, that trauma is rooted in personal, social, and political context and intersecting identities, right, that deeply influence each other. And we know because of that, trauma is unique to each person. So how I identify traumatic, or what I may identify as traumatic stressor, may be very different than somebody else on this call. And finally, we know the experience of trauma is subjective and developmentally and culturally bound and expressed. So a child who's been experiencing, traumatic stress or wound at 5 versus 15 versus 20 will have potentially different developmental trajectories and impacts across the stage. And then we also know it's culturally bound, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. So what are some core areas that are impacted when we think about traumatic stress, developmentally core areas? First and foremost, we know that safety and regulation is the first one that we often see. And examples or common presentations, when we think about safety and regulation, we're thinking about threat to both physical and psychological safety, even when the stressor is removed, right? We also are thinking about children may show under or overreaction to stimuli. So what may be, stress, a stressor to that child may not be to somebody else. So really kind of changes in stimuli. We also see increased activity or underactivity levels. So we think about behavior and how that shows up. We can see changes in withdrawal. So things that they used to do, now longer they're not doing. Difficulty in identifying, expressing, and managing different emotions. And then difficulty with impulse control, right? And then behavior regulation. And again, what these presentations will look like will be different for elementary age child, a middle school, or an adolescent. We also see impact on connection and relationships. We know that so much of trauma and traumatic stress happens in relationships and is deeply interpersonal. So kids may experience difficulty trusting others, both peers and adults. They may have a hard time building and maintaining relationships. And you can see sometimes over or under reliance on others. They may get very, very close to people or keep their distance from individuals. We know there's an impact on cognition and learning. So here we're thinking about difficulty with expressive or receptive language, impaired executive functioning, right? So problem solving skills, difficulty with memory, both short and long term, difficulty planning ahead, anticipating future, like what is to come. And then also difficulty with abstract reasoning. So taking information and being able to kind of summarize it and give it back. And then finally, we know that trauma also impacts sense of self. And here we're really thinking about alterations in self-perception. So how we understand ourselves. Kids can experience feelings of shame or guilt. Why was I the one that got out and other family members didn't? There can be low self-esteem, right? How they feel about themselves and self-doubt, but also alterations out of the world. If you live through community violence, there may be justified reasons to say that the world is an unsafe place. I shouldn't trust people. I shouldn't open myself up to people. So even how you understand your present world, but also, as Doris was talking about, how you understand your future and what's ahead for you. And we also know there be, increased hopelessness and helplessness. Why should I bother? Things will never change. And what kids think is possible for them from this moment on. And we know when we think about communities that are impacted by displacement, that trauma is really a disconnection from self, right? And we think about internal systems that are impacted, disconnection from other people, so relational, and also from dignity, right? Of things that one has been through and has overcome. We also know for this community, there's a cumulative effect of trauma. There's a trauma itself, the event, the stressor, but there's also loss potentially. Physical loss, emotional loss. Families, as Kayla was talking about, experience a great deal of cultural bereavement. So loss of culture, loss of language, loss of identity, loss of language, and so forth, right? And that how, as we just said, how individuals experience that is deeply developmental. and also deeply connected to styles of coping, internal mechanisms of coping and history that they've had before. Finally, we know that trauma is culturally bound, as we said. So different cultures exhibit and explain symptoms in various ways. And we know that different cultures make meaning of diversity and resilience in different ways. If we think about a lot of communities we're working with, there are lots and lots of, wisdom and transgenerational growth, as well as trauma that's passed down to think about how we make meaning of awful things that have happened to us that can be protective and also can be a source of stress. And we also know that, often there can be mental health stigma and language barriers. And this mental health stigma can often be rooted in, again, socio-political structures and oppression the families have received. So it may be absolutely true that families have had negative experience and therefore opening themselves up or receiving help can feel scary and overwhelming. So here are some key questions, just like we did in other sections, to really think about what are the considerations I should be thinking about individually as well as a school system to support kids who are impacted by trauma. Okay. The last piece of today is really thinking about the roles of schools. And we know we've talked a lot about context and importance of context. And the reason why, we wanted to develop this entire training that focuses on schools and educators and school professionals is that we know, as we've just said, that trauma and traumatic stress is often part of the story and the experiences of families who are displaced. However, we also know the social context in which the families arrives, meaning the resettlement experience itself, and the degree to which, both on an individual level and a family level, that system experiences a culture of stress, the degree to which that child and that family system feels a sense of school belonging and connection versus isolation and disconnection, and a degree to which, families experience discrimination will have huge implications on how they adjust and will be a huge predictor, right, on their mental health and well-being overall. Which means that schools, and this is a very reason I became a school psychologist, school environments are critical in then supporting forcibly displaced communities. We know that for many families, and if you work with immigrant families, I'm sure you've heard this, that education is the reason often families see their source of hope and future. So kids are looking for, right, ways to integrate into their new school. School systems then become a critical environment for acculturation adjustment. It will often be the place where kids spend the most time once they arrive. And in that process, they're really looking for trusted adults and students who can help guide that process for them, right? Which means that even if families have experienced some of the stressors we talked about as part of pre-migration, migration, and even resettlement, all of us in this room, all of us on this call, have an opportunity to serve as a resource and a protective factor that can really provide meaningful change and impact on students' well-being and mental health. And finally, when we think about, before I go to Doris, when we think about youth who migrated, there was a great little study that looked at what are the factors that kids consider as part of the resilience. And here we're really thinking about both psychological factors. So again, internal mechanisms, coping mechanisms that we have, but we're equally looking at structural opportunities for growth and connection, where schools lie, classrooms and communities that we're all part of. And it's really the balance of these two that we need to consider when we're thinking about promoting resilience and healing among our immigrant refugee youth. And kids often will tell us that it's really the interaction between who they are and what they have, who and what they have lost, and who and what they have regained that either help them survive and thrive or cause them pain and further suffering. And if you continue with us in the future trainings, we will then begin to really think about ways of promoting resilience and coping and programming within our schools. But as part of our closing, I'm going to pass it back to Doris to talk about how some of the core stressors that and strengths has helped her as she resettled.
Thank you, Vanya. So this is a very old picture of Somerville High School. I don't think Somerville High School looks like this anymore, but I don't think Mr. Google had an updated picture of Somerville High School. So I have lots of things to say about Somerville High School and of course the staff members. But when I think about the Welcome Center, I think about family, I think about warm, I think about people to reach out, people to trust. Many good things about them. Staff were very understanding. Many of the teachers, they let me focus on, learning in the classroom instead of related on homework. And at this point in life, based on many trainings that I have done, at this point, I think that most of my ex-teachers know already that I did not do my homework. I don't feel proud of this, but that's what I had to do, based on my situation and working extra hours every single week, so I didn't have much time to do my homework. I promise I do my homework now and in college because I cannot copy on college, but anyways, so um on my last year of high school, I was able to have a very flexible schedule. So this was actually really important to me because that's when I got my first fancy job. So I had to be, I was working in a local bank as a teller, very stressful job, but I gained a lot of knowledge. So I had to start working at 12 to 4. So on my last year of school, so they allowed me to go to school 7, at regular time, and then leave at 11:30 to be able to get to work on time as well, which was, very, very helpful. I learned a lot of money English because I did not know any money English at that time. So the importance of consistency on the staff members. Staff members were worried about me most of the time. I did miss school a lot, so that was not something new on me because I was, tired most of the time. But this day, that's a day that I will remember for forever. I woke up in the morning with several phone calls from staff members, and that was very unusual because, I used to get a phone call saying that, hey, you promised to be in school today and you were not. But that time I had multiple phone calls, so I called him back. And when this person responded, she was like, I am so glad that you are okay. And then I found out that there was this girl was found dead on the same street I lived in, and she had red hair, and I had red hair as well. So they really thought that it was me. So that's when I thought that they were not only random people in the school system, they were actually people that care about me and people that I called family. And I still call them family because I didn't have family here in the US, so I needed to adopt a family. So the communication between Welcome Center staff and teachers were amazing especially because I didn't speak English and most of my teachers didn't speak Spanish. So to communicate with them was very difficult. And of course, like in my situation, I was more like, can you talk to the teacher? But they thought me to face my problems and face my teachers and speak to the teachers and explain them what was my concerns, and also to explain them my situation in Spanish, and I had someone translating me. So that helped me a lot to actually get, one-on-one with teachers, and that, it was very, very helpful. So the Welcome Center staff, I think that, as I mentioned before, that was my safe place to go. I always felt very welcome, and every time that I had to go for any reasons and they didn't have the time to see me at that moment, they always reached out, which was which made me feel important. And at the same time, the trust was already built. And I think building trust is always like something really hard to do, especially as someone who didn't have family here in the US and didn't speak the language as as right now. So, and I realized that if teachers and counselors believed in me, then I had to believe in myself as well, because I thought that they were actually seeing something in me that I wasn't able to see. And that's what helped me to be here today with all of you. Back to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Doris, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I know that we are, a few minutes before closing, so please, if you, couple things, there is we will be sharing the slides, we will be sharing the recording. We're also putting in the chat a link to a survey, just satisfaction survey about today's training. So please take a moment to fill it out. We always love to hear feedback from folks. And then if you have any questions, and I'm not sure if maybe we can take one question or two before we close out. Feel free, and I'll look to my teammates because I can't look at our chat to see if there's some questions that we can take, maybe one or two for our time. These are emails if you want to directly email us. If we do not get to questions, I said we'll make sure to share them as well. And then the last thing I'll just say before we go to questions is that our next training will be on March 19th. We are putting in the chat as well, in addition to the survey, a link for registration if you're interested in coming back. And this training will really be thinking about how do we create welcoming school communities. So really thinking about prevention and promotion efforts in schools to support immigrant refugee youth. Okay, can we open up for one or two questions in our last 2 minutes?